Ivan Andreevich Belov, 48 years old but looking 60, sat leaning against the rough trunk of a cedar tree and waited. The damp autumn air settled heavily on his face, weathered by wind and frost, to the state of old skin, covered with a network of wrinkles, deep as the beds of dried-up rivers. Motionless, he was almost invisible against the backdrop of the harsh landscape of the Siam taiga. His eyes, the color of the winter sky, were narrowed, and his heavy, attentive gaze had earned him the nickname Raven many years ago, when he was still serving as senior inspector of the reserve. Now that gaze was fixed on a barely noticeable mark on the damp moss, a thin strip left by a maral's hoof. This was his book, his laboratory, his court, the forest that never lied. Nearby, curled up in a tight grey ball, lay Shadow, a West Siberian Laika, his only constant companion, and perhaps the only creature he trusted unconditionally. She too did not move, listening to the silence which concealed more sounds than any city noise. This order was broken by the thin, insistent ringing of a satellite phone attached to his breast pocket. Ivan Andreevich took his time, but still picked up the phone. The voice on the other end was hoarse and strained, belonging to District Police Officer Smirnov, a man who had long understood that asphalt and concrete were his territory, and everything more than 5 kilometers from the nearest lamppost belonged to Voron. Ivan Andreevich, again I'm calling you not because of my job, but because of necessity. Zavadsky, Ignats Petrovich, do you know him? The gold miner? He died, and it looks like it was natural causes. Heart. But his relatives flocked to his factory like flies to honey, and there's something fishy. They say it was an accident, but I don't like it. Voron only grunted briefly, the sound like flint striking steel. What exactly don't you like, Smirnov? Everything. Ignat Petrovich left a will that's more like a mockery. And now one of his nephews, Pyotr, has disappeared. The relatives are screaming. And by law, I can't even open the door to his damn fortress. I need you to read where this mess started, and where old Zavadsky finished his business. Voron unbuckled his knife and checked the blade with his thumb, a ritual signifying acceptance of the job. His job was never to catch poachers according to protocol. His task was different: to find the point where human greed had disrupted the natural order. I'll be there in the evening. Wait by the river. Don't take any action on your own. He cut off the connection, and silence closed in again. Ignat Petrovich Zavadsky was a living legend in these parts, a former illegal immigrant who found his gold mine in the darkest of times. He didn't just make a fortune. He forged it out of his own obsession and paranoia. Zavadsky never trusted banks or people. He only believed in fortified walls and the laws of the taiga, which he himself constantly broke. On the banks of a remote river, he built the trading post. Not a manor, but a real fortress. A double palisade, surveillance cameras, a diesel generator, and powerful, safe-like doors. It was said that he kept there not only legal valuables, but also an untouched gold vein that he never registered, or a cache of artifacts collected from the small peoples of Siberia, whom he, according to rumors, robbed. His death, sudden and quiet, was as mysterious as his whole life. And now that old wolf was gone, the jackals had descended on his scent. Relatives he barely remembered, but who were now united by a common hope for a fabulous inheritance. It took Voron almost a day to reach the trading post, 25 kilometers of dense taiga, where he did not walk, but floated through the thicket. With every kilometer he traveled, the air became heavier, as if thick, sticky fear had been mixed into it, and it was not the fear of a beast or bad weather. It was fear born of human greed. The shadow walked quietly, clinging to its master's feet, its ears twitching restlessly. It too felt the alien tension. Zavadsky's trading post turned out to be exactly as it had been described. A citadel in the wilderness, an ugly scar on the body of the forest.
A tall, time-blackened palisade, iron-bound gates, and gloomy windows that looked at the world with suspicion. Even the smoke from the chimney seemed unnaturally straight and harsh, like smoke from unburned resentment.
Smirnov waited at the gate, shifting nervously from foot to foot. He looked haggard, his eyes pleading and relieved. "Finally, Ivan Andreevich. It's a madhouse in there. They fight over every word. And now Peter is gone. Zavadsky has trapped everyone." Voron nodded silently, his gaze already scanning the area.
Crushed grass. Tire tracks from an expensive SUV carelessly parked near the barn. And, most importantly, dozens of city footprints that were trying to look like taiga footprints. He felt the pressure of the trading post, not from its walls, but from the human greed enclosed within it. Passing through the heavy gates, he found himself in the courtyard where the heirs had gathered. There were 4 of them, 4 people who looked like they had stepped out of different, poorly matched portraits. All of them were relatives of Zavadsky, who had come from the big city to grab their piece of the golden pie. There was Georgy, his nephew, a financier from Novosibirsk, dressed in expensive but completely inappropriate clothing. His movements were jerky. He constantly adjusted his glasses, and he seemed to be terrified of getting his leather shoes dirty. Next to him stood Marina, his grandniece, a former actress whose beauty was already beginning to fade. She carried herself with ostentatious dignity, but her eyes feverishly followed everyone, and her slender fingers clutched the edge of her shawl. The third was Alexei, a distant relative, a geologist who knew a lot about stones, but, as Voron could tell from his clothes, was clearly not very successful. He was the only one who looked relatively appropriate, but his gaze was too heavy, too attentive, and he did not take his eyes off Voron. Finally, there was Lydia, an elderly woman, Zavadsky's cousin, who seemed to be the most sincere in her grief, or the most skilled at portraying it. Voron did not waste time on greetings. His method was reading without words. He looked not at faces, but at feet and hands. Georgy crossed his arms over his chest, a defense, a fear of the unknown. Marina constantly touched her throat, a hidden lie, inner panic. Alexei, on the contrary, stood unnaturally straight, his fingers relaxed, but his eyes like those of a man ready to pounce. That was the most dangerous thing. Lydia clutched a small icon and hardly moved. Voron saw neither grief nor regret in them, only exhausting anticipation and tension. These people were not mourning their uncle. They were mourning their possible misfortune. Smirnov quickly brought Raven up to speed. The will had been read 2 days ago and consisted of only one sentence, written in Zavadsky's hand on a yellowed sheet of parchment. "Whoever finds my secret room will get everything." The notary, who had flown in especially, just shrugged his shoulders. Legally, it was valid, given his unconventional views on life. After that, the ferment began. The relatives, first in collusion, then individually, set out to search. And then Pyotr, the hunter nephew, the only one who really knew his way around the tiger, disappeared. His disappearance turned the game into a deadly hunt. Raven, looking at George, who had already wiped his glasses 3 times, said dryly, "Did you find anything?" "What was the first clue?" Georgie flinched, as if he had been electrocuted, and began to explain incoherently how they had found the first clues in Zavadsky's old hunting guide. He spoke a lot, and quickly, but Voron heard only noise. He turned away from the financier and looked at Alexei. "You're a geologist. Did you understand what he was talking about?" Alexei nodded slowly. Zavadsky thought in old prospecting terms. His secret room is either a gold vein or a place where he brought his treasures for decades. The clues must be tied to geodesy, but only to the kind that is known here, in this wilderness. Piotr, he knew the old trails. He was the first to go on his tip. The geologist's voice was low and calm, but his posture betrayed an excessive, almost deliberate carelessness. It wasn't indifference. It was a lie in his gait, one that Voron had seen before. A man too confident in his next step to allow himself to be nervous. The tiger had taught him, if you are too calm when you should be afraid, it means you already know what will happen. Voron felt the tension in the air at the trading post reach its limit, like a bowstring ready to snap. He nodded to Smirnov and headed for his things. "First I'll find Peter, then I'll solve his riddle." He had to go out into the forest to read not the will, but the traces left by greed. The real work began where human words ended. Already in the main hall of the trading post, which resembled an arsenal rather than a living room, Voron sensed a dense, almost tangible atmosphere woven from impatience and undisguised greed. It smelled of old wood, gun oil, and something elusively sour. The smell of rotting trust. In the center stood a roughly hewn table on which lay the only relic remaining from the official part of the ceremony. An old yellowed parchment. The very one that contained the last will and testament of Ignaz Petrovich Zavadsky. Around the table, like predators around their cold prey, gathered the remaining heirs and the local police officer, Smirnov, who radiated helplessness, far from civilization. Marina, the grandniece, unable to bear the tension, pulled her hand away from the parchment as if it had burned her. "This is a joke, just a joke. Why? Why did he come up with all this? We flew here thousands of kilometers to read this treasure map, drawn by a madman. I have a job. George has loans. Alexei has..." She didn't finish, but Voron caught her gaze, full of poorly concealed anger. There was no room in her eyes for grief or fear. Only an obsession with the truth expressed in the ringing of metal. Georgie, a financier, on the contrary, tried to give the situation a veneer of businesslike activity. He wiped his glasses, gritted his teeth, and repeated, "We must work logically. This is a cryptogram. Zavadsky was a meticulous man. If he encrypted something, it means it can be decrypted. This is not mysticism, but the key to his accounts to the gold." His belief in logic and numbers was almost religious. But Voron saw that every time Georgie tried to pick up the paper, his hands began to tremble slightly. The financier was not afraid of the tiger. He was afraid of losing. Voron silently approached the table. Smirnov, sensing support, nodded toward the parchment. "Here. That's the whole point. The notary confirmed the authenticity of the signature." "The text is just crazy." Voron leaned over the document. The will, written not in ink, but it seemed in charcoal diluted in alcohol,
was brief, like an epitaph. Whoever finds my secret room will get everything. Go where the deaf boar sleeps at the Four Brothers and look for his trail. There he hid his second skin. So be it. The tiger spoke its own language, and Zavadsky, an illegal prospector, could not write any other way. It was a tiger cryptogram, a system of signs and landmarks understandable only to those who lived here, not by the law, but by their feelings. The raven touched the text with its finger. Deaf boar was not an animal. It could be the name of a geological formation, a steep ridge, or a rock. In the taiga, such figurative names were given to key locations that were easy to remember but difficult to find on a map. Four Brothers was most likely four old cedars growing unusually close to each other. A stable, centuries-old geographical marker. Second skin was already a clue pointing to a cache, a hiding place that prospectors sometimes covered with birch bark or thick bark to protect it from moisture. See? Voron looked up, scanning his relatives with a gaze as heavy and calm as that of a bird of prey. This is not a bank account. This is a test of your knowledge of his life. Ignat Petrovich did not leave you money. He left you his life's work. Marina recoiled as if he had struck her, and Georgie frowned incredulously. But where? Where is this boar? In which square? His questions were from the world of maps, satellites, and precise measurements. Voron just shook his head. There are no squares in the taiga, Georgie. There is a sense of place. Alexei, the geologist, suddenly intervened, his calmness, which had previously seemed like composure, now looking like a mask, cracked under the pressure of greed. I know where it is. At least, I think I do. When Zavadsky was alive, he often mentioned the legend of the Wild Boar Ridge, a mountain range 30 kilometers to the northwest. And there, if I'm not mistaken, there's a place where people constantly go for nuts. There are indeed 4 cedars growing there, almost like a monument. But it's in the middle of nowhere. It's impossible to get there quickly. Voron kept his eyes on him. There was not the slightest emotion in Alexei's words, only pure information that he had kept to himself. He had kept it for too long. Did Peter know about this? Voron asked quietly. Alexei nervously stroked his unshaven chin. Pyotr was a hunter. He knew every trail in the area. We discussed this version. He left yesterday morning in that direction. He said he'd be back by evening, but the silence that followed his words was thicker than the densest fog. Voron felt fear and impatience begin to crumple the space around him. Each of them understood. Peter, the only true expert on the taiga, was one step ahead. Now, he was gone. If he was gone, it meant that he had either found it or was too close to solving the mystery. Voron looked at Georgi, who was eagerly studying Alexei as if trying to steal his knowledge. Then at Marina, whose eyes were full of tears. But these were not tears of grief, but of fear of loss. The loss of possible gold. And finally, to Alexei himself. Unlike the others, he did not look frightened. He looked annoyed. Annoyed that his knowledge was now public property, that he was forced to share information. So, Voron straightened up, his voice low and hoarse, like the rustling of dry leaves. We have a mystery, and a missing person who most likely solved it. Ignat Petrovich
set up a game, and some of you decided that the rules didn't apply to you. He slowly walked around the table, his heavy, functional boots leaving clear marks on the dusty floor. His entire figure, sinewy and weathered, was a living reproach to their urban uncleanliness. He stopped next to Lydia, the elderly woman sitting in the corner, the only one who had not rushed for the parchment, poured herself some water from the jug with a trembling hand. "Didn't you go, Lydia Andreevna?" Voron asked. "No, Ivan Andreevich. I'm already 70. Ignat, he always liked to mock greed. This game is not for me. For me, his death is simply the end." There was sincerity in her words, but Voron was not sure that it was the sincerity of grief. Rather, it was humility. Humility that the game was already lost, and participation in it was useless. "Tomorrow morning, I'll follow Peter's trail," Voron announced, addressing no one in particular. "Smirnov's conclusions that it was a bear or an accident don't satisfy me." A man who knows the tiger doesn't just fall like that. If he fell, he was pushed. His words, spoken with such calm confidence, sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the trading post. He walked over to the window and looked at the gathering twilight. The trading post window was narrow, like a loophole, and his gaze swept over the surrounding area. Under the window, where relatives had been bustling about the day before, the grass was trampled. Voron read the grass. Disorderly steps, nervous stops, and, most importantly, fresh but carefully camouflaged tracks leading away from the house. Tracks that someone had tried to hide by walking over them several times. Lies in the tracks. "One of you," Raven muttered, addressing himself and Shadow who lay at his feet, "has broken the main law of the taiga. You can only kill to survive." He felt that the killer was here, among these people, hidden under a mask of grief or rationalism, and he couldn't let greed continue down this path. Georgie laughed nervously. "Ivan Andreevich, you're like a character from a book. Mysteries, clues, laws of the taiga. We're here to divide up an inheritance, not discuss moral principles." Voron did not deign to answer him. He slowly turned and looked at Georgie, then at Marina, at Lydia, and finally fixed his gaze on Alexei. There was no anger in that gaze, only cold, predatory determination. He saw Alexei tense up, his shoulders rising slightly, as if he were preparing to lunge. "You can call it whatever you want," Raven replied in a low, hoarse voice. "But for me, this is where the natural order of things began to be disrupted, and I will end it. One of you has already found the key and decided that he doesn't need a witness. Or maybe he forced Peter to find that key." He walked toward the exit. The shadow rose, its eyes glowing in the darkness. They were leaving to find the body, but in reality, to find the truth hidden in fear. Raven knew that the forest remembered everything. He just had to learn to read its new, bloody page. In the morning, he would go to where the deaf boar sleeps to find Peter. But he felt that he would return not with one, but with two dead bodies, the victim and the murderer, who was already dead, his soul poisoned by gold. Ignat Zavatsky, that old, eccentric wolf, continued to set his traps even after death, and now his own heirs had fallen into them. He left the trading post, leaving behind the stench of greed and fear. Tomorrow would show him the first trace of blood. Morning in the taiga
begins not with dawn, but with silence, which replaces the silence of night, becoming thinner and more tense. Ivan Andreevich and Shadow moved northwest to where, according to Alexei's calculations, the Wild Boar Ridge was located. The Raven was in no hurry, moving with an unhurried confidence that inspired fear. He did not simply walk in a direction. He read the ground, which for him was not just soil, but parchment covered with thousands of tracks and marks. The relatives who remained at the trading post tried to appear busy. Georgie, the financier, once again immersed himself in studying Zavadsky's papers, hoping to find an accounting trail to the gold. Marina alternated between hysterical fits and attempts to flirt with Smirnov, trying to extract information. Only Alexei, the geologist, sat quietly, sharpening his knife and waiting, as if he were certain of the inevitability of what was happening. On the way, Voron found traces of their journey from the previous day. There were the careless footprints of Georgie, who was clearly trying to walk like an experienced hiker, but constantly stumbled and left deep dents where his foot should have only touched the moss. Marina's small, frequent footprints indicated nervous haste. And, most interestingly, Peter's barely noticeable professional footprints. The hunter walked quickly, easily, like the spirit of the forest. But suddenly, after about 5 kilometers, his footprints became more confident, more purposeful. Peter had found something. He had solved Zavadsky's riddle. And this knowledge, like a deadly burden, led to his demise. Peter was found 2 hours later, far from the beaten path, in a low-lying area at the foot of a massive old cedar tree. 4 huge trunks fused at the base formed a monumental group, the 4 brothers. It was a perfect, indestructible marker. Peter's body lay under one of the trunks. The sight was horrible, but paradoxically natural. The broken neck, numerous bruises, torn clothes. Death that could easily be attributed to a fall from a height, if not for one but. Smirnov, who arrived shortly after, had already drawn his conclusions. An accident, Ivan Andreevich. He probably climbed a tree to look for a hiding place, lost his footing, and fell. Look, his arm is even twisted unnaturally. He was probably drunk, or just careless. The Taiga does not forgive mistakes. Voron did not answer. He was not listening. He was reading. The first thing that caught his eye was the loss of balance. Yes, Peter could have fallen, but a man born in the taiga does not fall the way a city dweller falls. He instinctively braces himself, grabs branches, tries to stop the fall. But here, there was a complete lack of any attempt at defense. Moreover, the grass and moss around the cedar tree had not been trampled as a result of a fall. They had been trampled in a short but fierce struggle. The raven knelt down by the cedar tree. There were no claw marks on the smooth, old bark covered with moss and lichen. No traces of desperate grasping. So he didn't slip. At a height of 3 meters, Raven discovered a faint, barely noticeable damage to the brooch, which could have been caused not by a fall, but by a blow or a sharp jerk. He was dead when he fell, Raven said quietly, his voice sounding like a verdict. He examined the grass. Around Peter's body, among the chaotic traces of his struggle,
There were others that Smirnov attributed to the commotion of the search. But Voron saw something else. He saw two types of tracks. The first was Peter's tracks of fear. Deep, uneven, sliding toward the cedar tree. Peter was running. The second was tracks of confidence that surrounded it all. These were the tracks of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. This second trace, a boot print in the soft earth, was too clean, too precise. It had been placed deliberately, without haste. The man who left it was moving with purpose, not in panic or search. He approached Peter from behind, by the cedar tree, and most likely used a short, deadly technique to instantly break his resistance. And then he threw the body off the cedar tree, staging an accident. The raven picked up a small piece of birch bark from the ground, which Peter must have been clutching tightly in his hand before it was thrown away. It had a rough, hastily drawn pattern on it, several symbols resembling ancient runes or taiga markings, and next to them, 3 scratched words: "Under the second skin." This was the second clue. Peter had not only solved the riddle of the death boar, he had found the next point marked on the birch bark, or had marked it himself before his death. The killer didn't find it. The killer was looking for gold, or money, on the body, but didn't think about the cryptogram on the bark. His greed was too straightforward. He disrupted the natural course of events for profit, but made a mistake by neglecting the details. "The motive is clear," Voron muttered, looking at the birch bark. "Greed and speed." The killer realized that Peter was ahead of him and decided to eliminate his competitor before he could claim the inheritance. Smirnov, who had been watching Raven's silent examination, swallowed nervously. "Murder, you mean? Who?" "They're all there, at the trading post. Someone who could follow Peter without being noticed. Someone who isn't afraid of the wilderness. Someone who can deliver a blow that leaves no struggle. Only a short, powerless trace." Voron stood up, his gaze heavy as lead, and someone who, upon returning, showed not the slightest sign of alarm. Someone who demonstrates falsehood in their gait, confidence where there should be alarm. Voron did not examine the body further. He had already gotten the main thing, the story of Peter's fear and the story of the killer's confidence. He walked a little to the side and found what he was looking for. Another trace. A deep imprint that someone had tried to hide by covering it with pine needles. But the pine needles were dry, and the footprint beneath them was wet and clear. It was not Peter's footprint, nor was it a footprint of panic. It was the footprint of a boot with an unusual, expensive sole, which Raven had already seen at the trading post. It was a footprint of the city in the heart of the taiga, and it belonged to one of the remaining heirs. He walked around the 4 brothers, looking up at the tops of the cedars, which seemed to be silently watching this crime. The taiga did not judge, but it remembered. It preserved every trace, every sound, every act of violence. And now it was giving its testimony. "We're going back," said Voron to Smirnov, hiding the birch bark in his pocket. "Call the police to take the body away. But for now, it's an accident." Let them think they've won. That's their biggest mistake. The killer has upset the balance. Now he himself will become a sick individual who needs to be removed from the system. He walked back confidently, leaving only his own unhurried footprints behind him. The shadow, as if sharing his thoughts, growled toward the cedars. 3 people were waiting for him at the trading post, feigning grief and anticipation,
But in reality, they were consumed by deadly greed. The raven had to read in their eyes what he had already read in the tracks. He had to find the one who showed no signs of fear, who was too confident in his next step to be innocent. The one who, upon returning, did not even try to hide his victory. Ivan Andreevich knew that now the killer, sensing blood and the proximity of treasure, would act faster. The next clue, under the second skin, was already with him. It was the key. But it was also bait. He had to use it to lure the beast out before it struck again. Returning to the trading post was not the end of the search, but the beginning of a game of waiting, where the masks would come off, revealing the beastly essence. He felt greed, like sticky poison, already spreading through the trading post, and he had to stop it before it consumed everyone. Moving to a safe distance from the four brothers, Ivan Andreevich Belov stopped. He did not trust the forest that had just given up the body. A forest that has received a sacrifice always quietens down for a short time. But this calm is deceptive. While Smirnov bustled about, calling the task force via satellite, which would arrive soon, and was unlikely to find anything, Voron did what he did best: tiger forensics. He ignored the dead Peter, focusing on his last moments and, most importantly, on who had cut those moments short, and why. Voron knew that Peter's death was caused by a fracture of the cervical vertebrae, most likely from a sharp blow or jerk. It was not an attack by a wild animal. An animal would have left teeth and claw marks on the body, but here there was only the neat, albeit terrible, work of a person who had staged the fall. He returned to the cedar tree, not approaching the body, but moving around the perimeter, as if reading an invisible circle. He had no fluorescent lamps or powders in his arsenal. His tools were his eyes and his knowledge of how a frightened or confident person behaves in the wilderness. He carefully, inch by inch, examined the moss and last year's pine needles, ignoring Peter's chaotic footprints. He needed the killer's footprint. He had already noticed one, the imprint of an expensive city shoe with aggressive tread, which someone had tried to cover up. Now he was looking for microscopic details. Near the cedar tree, where the ground was slightly damp, he found two tiny, almost invisible details. The first was a small, perfectly round scratch on the side of one of the cedar's protruding roots. It looked as if it had been left by a thin metal rod. The second, a microscopic lump of clay, unusual for this place, stuck in a crack in the bark. The clay was reddish, with flecks of mica. Raven knew that such clay was characteristic of old, abandoned ore mines. The trace of the victim's fear was clear. Peter had probably discovered that he was being followed. He quickened his pace. His movements became nervous, and his heartbeat, which Raven could feel in his uneven gait, was racing wildly. Peter ran to the cedar tree, realized that the solution was close, and possibly turned around to face the threat. He did not try to climb the tree to hide his find. He tried to use it as a shield. The killer approached too quickly, too quietly. The motive was obvious and cynical. Greed, multiplied by impatience. Peter was the most knowledgeable. He was on the home stretch of the first puzzle. The killer, who was probably following Peter at a distance, realized he wouldn't make it in time. He didn't want to share, he wanted it all. Ignat Savatsky, himself obsessed with gold, couldn't leave another test behind. His riddle was not about geography, but about human nature.
Voron ran his hand over the cedar, his gaze empty, but his brain working with cold clarity. The killer was not just a hired gun, but someone from within. Someone who was at the trading post. Georgie? Too panicky. Too much fuss. Marina? Too fragile and emotional to deliver such a precise, deadly blow. Lydia? Too old, but her humility was suspicious. Alexei? A geologist. An expert on rocks and ore workings. The only one with professional knowledge of taiga markers and ores. Voron remembered their conversation. Alexei was the first to confidently name the Wild Boar Ridge. He was too calm when talking about his missing relative. His lie in his gait, which Voron noticed immediately. This deliberate confidence, this lack of anxiety. Now Raven connected the details. The footprint of a clean, expensive shoe at the trading post. Alexei was a geologist, and geologists, even unsuccessful ones, wear expensive, professional footwear. A lump of red clay with mica near the cedar tree. Alexei, by virtue of his profession, knew ore deposits well, and knew where to find this clay. A round scratch on the root. It could have been the end of a geological hammer, or the shaft of a navigation device, which could have caused a blow or scratch when fixed quickly and carelessly. All the clues were in the taiga. The taiga, like a living organism, had imprinted them, and Voron was the only one who could read them. The motive was greed. The weapon was knowledge. He turned and, without looking back, headed for the trading post, carrying the birch bark with a new, bloody clue in his pocket. Under the second skin. That was his trump card. A nervous calm reigned at the trading post. Smirnov stayed behind to wait for the task force, while the heirs gathered again in the main hall, trying to dissect the will into atoms. When Raven entered, they fell silent, as if taken by surprise.
Pyotr is dead, Voron announced, his voice dry and impassive. This was no accident. It was murder. The reaction was instantaneous and telling. Marina screamed, covering her face with her hands.
Her reaction was hysterical, but oddly enough, sincere. It was fear for her life, not fear of exposure. Georgie jumped up, knocking over his chair. Murder? Who? Who could have done it? Zavadsky, he drove us all crazy. We have to leave immediately. His panic was genuine, based on fear of losing control, not guilt. Alexei, however, did not move. He sat sharpening his knife, and only his eyes, in which Voron saw cold, calculating confidence, gave him away. He looked up and said, "It's a pity about Peter. He was the only one who knew these places. Now it will be twice as difficult to find the secret room." There was no trace of fear. That was the decisive clue. "You're lying, Alexei," said Voron, moving closer. "You don't feel sorry for Peter. You're annoyed that his death forced you to share information about Vepa and the brothers. You knew where he was. You went after him." Alexei slowly lowered the knife onto the table, his calmness icy. "Evidence? I was here, like everyone else. The evidence is in the taiga. Your lie is in your gait. You're too confident. You're too clean for a man who should be afraid. And another thing." Voron took out the birch bark. "He managed to find this. Your brother, Peter. This is the second clue. He found the place that Zavadsky called second skin. Only you, a geologist,
and expert on all veins, knew that Zawadzki, as a prospector, could use old mines or abandoned tunnels to hide his stashes. You knew how to read these signs. You knew that the second skin was a hiding place covered with birch bark. Voron did not wait for a confession. He knew that this man was a sick individual, poisoned by greed, who would not back down. He threw the birch bark on the table, and all eyes, full of wild, undisguised greed, turned to it. Second skin. The key. The bait. "I'm going there. Alone," announced Raven. He knew that the killer would not be able to resist. The killer, who had already smelled the gold, would not let him find the secret room. "Whoever tries to get there before me will confirm my conclusions." For the first time ever, Alexei smiled. A crooked smile full of contempt. "You think you can play Zawadzki's games, old hermit? Fine. Go. The taiga is a dangerous place. Your trail will disappear there, faster than Peter's." It was not a threat. It was a promise, backed by confidence in his impunity. Without saying a word, Raven turned and left. The shadow slipped after him. Behind him lay the trading post, seething with boiling greed. But now he had not only a trail, but also a name. And he knew that the killer would come after him. His path lay to the second skin, and that path would be the last for one of them. Raven felt the moral meaning of his mission shift from reading tracks to restoring order. The sick beast had to be removed before it infected the whole pack. He was not going for gold. He was going for justice in the taiga. The Raven returned to the trading post, bringing with him not only the news of Peter's death, but also a heavy, dense sense of the killer's presence. He already knew who it was, but he needed evidence that not only the taiga would understand, but also the law. In his pocket was a piece of birch bark that Peter had managed to scratch out or find. It was a map on the skin. The second part of Ignat Zawadzki's riddle. He immediately headed for Zawadzki's empty room, which served as his office. His relatives, shocked by the news of the murder, froze in the hall, not daring to follow him. Only Alexei, the geologist, stared intently at Voron's back. And in that stare, there was no longer the former ostentatious calm, only predatory alertness. Voron closed the heavy oak door behind him. The office resembled a museum of obsession. The walls were paneled with cedar, on which hung old maps, compasses, gold panning equipment, and dried herbs. Voron approached Zawadzki's desk. The first thing he did was take out the birch bark. On it, in addition to the phrase, "under the second skin," several complex symbols were scratched. They resembled a mixture of ancient runes and signs used by geologists and illegal prospectors. A crossed-out circle, an arrow with 3 feathers, a zigzag line leading to a point. It was a cryptogram of the gold rush. As a survival instructor and former state inspector, Raven knew these symbols. They were not official surveying marks. It was a secret language, understood only by those who lived outside the law, in eternal search of profit. Raven unfolded an old worn map hanging on the wall. Not a topographical one, but a handwritten one, where the names of rivers and ridges were replaced with figurative local names. Shaman's Cry, Bear's Tear, Wild Boar Ridge. He found the place on the map corresponding to the 4 brothers, the spot where Peter had died. From this point on the map, Zawadzki had drawn that very crossed-out circle.
Raven knew it was a sign of cancellation or refusal. Prospectors put it on the site of a depleted or false vein.
Zawadzki, you didn't just leave a riddle. You left your confession. Voron muttered, running his finger over the map. The translation of the cryptogram began, an arrow with 3 feathers. In the language of poachers, this meant rapid movement, or 3 days' journey. A zigzag line, not a river, but a snake. An old, abandoned road, or a channel through which water was driven. A dot. The final destination. Go to where the deaf boar sleeps at the Four Brothers. This is where Peter found the place. And look for his trail. That's where he hid his second skin. It's on the bark. The raven turned over the bark and found a small, almost imperceptible image of an old tiger hut on the back. A crooked log cabin, surrounded by a low, half-ruined fence. Ignat Petrovich left a visual clue for those who understood his world. The second skin is an old hut, covered with logs and birch bark for preservation, a hiding place. Ivan Andreevich understood the hidden meaning of the first and second clues. Zawadzki was not leading his heirs to a gold mine. He was leading them along the path of his life. From the place where he once began as an illegal immigrant, wild boar, that is, Zawadzki himself, to his first hideout, second skin. It was a path of atonement, or at least of coming to terms with his unrighteous life. Zawadzki's puzzles were not about coordinates, but about patience and understanding of the taiga. Those who sought quick profits, like Georgie, would never find these places. Those who knew the taiga, but were obsessed with greed, like Peter, and now like Alexei, did not possess the philosophy of the old prospector. Voron realized that Alexei had not simply followed Peter. He had made Peter work for him. The geologist did not know the tiger markers as well as the hunter, but he knew the psychology of a prospector and could quickly understand what his signs meant. He made Peter find the second clue and then removed the witness. Ivan Andreevich carefully took an old leather folder out of the desk drawer. It was empty, but at the bottom, Voron found what he was looking for: a yellowed, roughly sketched drawing depicting the entrance to a tunnel disguised as a pile of stones, and next to it, 3 words written in Zawadzki's handwriting: where the sun sleeps. This must have been the third clue that Zawadzki had kept with him. He didn't even trust the will. Voron returned to the hall where they were waiting for him. The tension was so thick that it seemed as if the walls of the trading post might crack. Georgie and Marina looked at him with poorly concealed horror and hope. Alexei, as always, sat, pretending to be coldly indifferent, but his gaze darted to Voron's hands. The second clue has been found, Voron said, raising the birch bark. Under the second skin. It's a hut. Zawadzki's old hideout. I'm going there right now. He didn't name the place. He simply announced the route. Alexei slowly got up. Ivan Andreevich, you are reckless. You already know that there is a killer here. Going alone is suicide. His voice was even, but there was a hidden threat in it that only Voron could read. He was trying to dissuade Voron so that he could calmly follow him later. The tiger, Alexei, does not like fuss and does not forgive unbelief. If someone has broken its law, they must be removed. Voron replied calmly. I'm going. If anyone dares to follow me, they will encounter not the mystery of Zawadzki, but me. He placed the birch bark on the table, next to the cartridge belt,
as if it were bait. He knew that greed would not allow them to stay.
The killer would not be able to sleep, knowing that the key to the gold was on the table and that Voron was moving toward his goal. He had to catch the predator with live bait. Voron left the trading post, and the shadow slipped alongside him.
He knew that Alexei would follow him. The killer did not know that Raven had already read his trail. He did not know that Raven already had a sketch of the tunnel in his hands, the fourth, main key that Zavadsky did not even entrust to his will.
Raven looked at the forest, at its harsh, indifferent facade. He walked toward the hideout, knowing that this would not be a search, but a hunt.
A hunt for the one who, out of greed, had committed the most terrible crime, violated the natural order of things. He felt the heavy burden of responsibility that weighed on his shoulders. He had to restore the balance.
The fortress factory that Ignat Zavadsky had built in the wilderness was not named so for nothing. It was a structure that breathed mistrust.
Thick log walls, narrow windows like loopholes, and heavy locks that were not intended to protect against beasts, but against human greed. The Raven returned to this stone bag, not to look for clues in the urban sense, fingerprints or fibers. He returned to read the people he had already declared the killer and the victims. His forensics were deeper, his tools more subtle. He gathered the remaining heirs in the hall. George, the financier, did not hide his fear. His expensive suit, crumpled and stained, seemed a symbol of his collapse in the face of wild nature.
Marina, the actress, smoked, releasing blue smoke that settled on the antique guns hanging on the wall. Her hysteria gave way to cold, calculating anticipation. Lydia, an elderly woman, sat as before in the corner, but now her hands did not just hold the icon, they clenched it until her knuckles turned white. And finally, Alexei, a geologist, sat with his hands folded on his knees, with perfect, unnatural calm. Voron began to speak, his voice low and hoarse, like the rustle of gravel. We know that Peter was murdered. We know that the motive was gold, the key to which he had found. Now we must understand which of you had the knowledge and opportunity to do this. He did not look at their faces, but at their bodies' reactions to the words murder and gold. George shuddered at the mention of murder, but at the word gold, his eyes lit up with the same unhealthy, feverish gleam. Greed overcame fear. Marina flinched at the word gold, and then quickly looked away. She was afraid that her greed would be noticed. Alexei, on the other hand, did not flinch once. His muscles remained relaxed. He controlled his body with professional precision. You said that Zavadsky left a key connected to his life, Alexei. Voron addressed the geologist. You knew very well what Deaf Boar was, and what Four Brothers was. Where were you yesterday morning when Peter left? I was here, at the trading post, studying Ignat Petrovich's papers. Alexei replied calmly. Pyotr went on his own. He was too cocky. His attempt to shift the blame onto the cockiness of the dead man was crude. Voron noticed how his jaw tensed at the word cocky. The lie was woven into the very tone of his voice. You're lying, Alexei. You knew what Peter had found. And you knew you had to follow him until he reached the next point. You could have left the trading post at the same time that, according to our data, he was killed. You have the scent of the tiger, which cannot be confused with the city. Voron raised his finger, not allowing the geologist to respond. Voron sensed a subtle, barely perceptible scent from Alexei. Not the smell of pure cedar, but the smell of damp earth mixed with kerosene or diesel fuel, a smell characteristic of long periods spent around machinery or in poorly ventilated underground spaces. Voron elicited only nervous, chaotic reactions from the rest of the group. Georgie insisted that he had no knowledge of the taiga except for financial reports. Marina claimed she was too scared. Lydia seemed to have withdrawn into herself. Having finished the interrogation, Voron headed for Zavadsky's office. He needed to study the life of the deceased to find out where it had led him. The office was his last message. Voron moved slowly, his hands sliding along the shelves lined with worn books on geology, old maps, and mineral samples. He stopped at the north wall, which was covered with the thickest cedar boards. He knew that old prospectors always left hiding places in the walls of their homes. Voron tapped the surface with his knuckles. The sound was dull and dense. In the middle of the wall was a void. A secret room is not just a storage space, it is a hidden space. He put his ear to the wall and listened. In the place where he found the strange hollow sound, the panel seemed slightly colder than the rest. Unusual sound insulation. It was a hint of a hidden passage or tunnel, leading somewhere down below, under the trading post, which Zavadsky, as an illegal immigrant, could have dug himself. Voron felt the tension of the trading post seeping into the walls. Surely, while he was examining the scene of the murder, one of the heirs had been rummaging around here, looking for the key. He found traces. On the thick layer of dust that covered the floor, there were fresh, sloppy footprints. Too small for Georgie, too heavy for Marina. They could have belonged to Alexei or Lydia. Voron returned to the table. He remembered the sketch of the tunnel he had found earlier and took it out again. The sketch was signed, 7 steps from the entrance. Voron figured, if the tunnel was under the trading post, where should the entrance be? The entrance must be camouflaged, but logically located in relation to the dwelling. He went out into the yard. His gaze fell on the shed where the diesel generator was kept. A thick cable ran from the shed to the trading post. Raven moved to the back wall of the shed. Where the ground was covered with old sawdust, he noticed a barely noticeable dip in the ground. Raven bent down. It smelled of kerosene and damp earth. The second suspicious trace he had been looking for in Alexei's scent now had a physical embodiment. The killer, Alexei, obviously knew about the underground passage. Perhaps his geological knowledge or his conversations with Zavadsky had given him the idea. The smell of kerosene and damp earth could mean that he had been there recently, not to look for gold, but to prepare, to cover his tracks, mine the passage, or block it. Raven, what are you doing there? Alexei's calm, alert voice came from behind. The geologist came out into the yard, holding an axe, supposedly for chopping wood. He was too calm, too confident. I'm reading the air, Alexei. You smell not only of greed, but also of the underground. The secret room is here, under the trading post, and you've already been there. You were looking not only for gold, but also for a way to eliminate your competitors. Voron did not wait for an answer. He knew that his statement was a direct threat. If Alexei was a murderer, he had to act. Voron turned away, ignoring the geologist, and took out his knife. He began slowly and methodically raking through the sawdust by the barn wall. He had to provoke him. He had to show that the key had been found. Under the sawdust, he found a heavy metal hatch, camouflaged by old, blackened wood. 7 steps from the wall. 7 steps from the entrance. Here is your secret room, Alexei.
And you've already been there. And you left your mark, which neither rain nor time can wash away. Alexei slowly lowered the axe. His face, which had been impassive until then, contorted. It was not panic, but the rage of a cornered beast.
He took a step. You don't understand, you old fool. Gold is order, it is life, it is worth any price. He took another step, gripping the axe handle tightly. Vran knew that a fight was inevitable,
But he got what he wanted. Confirmation of his theory. The disruption of the natural order of things had led to murder, and now it had led to open confrontation. He was ready.
He saw it in Alexei's eyes. His soul was already dead. All that remained was to stop his body. Raven raised his head and looked at the harsh, indifferent sky of the taiga. Today, order had to be restored. The Raven deliberately left the hatch open, not lifting it completely, but only sliding it a quarter of the way. This was enough for the murderer, possessed by greed, to believe that the way was clear, but too little to pass without touching him. He left the trading post like a careless tourist, heading for the old riverbed, which, according to his interpretation, led to the settlement. Second Koja. The shadow followed close behind, remaining a shadow. He moved according to the laws of the forest, silently, without haste, but with constant vigilance. His goal was not the hideout, but Alexei, who, as he knew, was already preparing to follow his trail. Raven understood. Alexei was not a hunter, not a taiga dweller. He was a geologist, a man of logic and knowledge of ore, but not of reading tracks. This was his weakness, which Raven intended to use against him.
After walking about 3 kilometers along the riverbed, Raven felt the hunt begin. The air became denser, the sounds of the forest sharper. Raven could not see Alexei, but he could read his tracks in the broken silence. The clumsily trampled grass, the broken branch that a true taiga dweller would have avoided, and, most importantly, the intermittent nature of the trail. Alexei had stopped to listen. He was confident in his invisibility. But this confidence was urban, alien to the forest. The raven suddenly stopped. The shadow tensed, pressing its ears flat. Ahead, in the thick undergrowth, he saw a disturbance. At knee level, between 2 old fir trees, a thin steel wire was stretched, barely visible against the dry grass. It was not a poacher's snare for animals, but a trap designed for humans. The trap was crudely set, but calculated for speed and inattention. Whoever set it expected that Raven, walking quickly along the trail, would not notice it, and would stumble, falling headfirst onto a rock or snag. The killer did not want noise. He wanted an accident. The killer uses taiga methods, but does so clumsily or too aggressively, Raven whispered. A person who truly respects the forest would never set such a crude trap that could hurt an animal. It was a crime against the laws of nature, the embodiment of greed that disregards everything for the sake of its goal. Voron carefully stepped over the wire. He did not disable it. On the contrary, he slightly loosened its attachment to one of the fir trees so that it would look suspicious and could be noticed by the killer. He wanted Alexei to know that he had been noticed. He continued on his way, but now his movements became demonstrative. He deliberately quickened his pace a little, as if he were absorbed in his search. He wanted Alexei, who was following him, to believe that his trap had failed because of the victim's carelessness, not because it had been noticed. Voron knew that Alexei, as a logical person, would not use the same method twice.
He would be forced to raise the stakes. A few minutes later, Raven reached the hut. It was a crooked log cabin, almost sunk into the ground, covered with darkened birch bark. The very same second skin. There were no tracks or trails around it.
The hideout was perfectly hidden from casual glance. Voron approached the crooked door. He smelled kerosene and damp earth again. Alexei had been here. He had found Zavadsky's hideout before Voron, but he hadn't taken the gold. He went inside.
The hut was empty, but in the middle of the room stood an old, dusty, moldy, portable safe. It was locked, but next to it, on the floor, lay a dismantled set of geological exploration tools. An old compass, a protractor, and, most importantly, a miniature old-fashioned radio transmitter. Voron understood Zavadsky's game. The hiding place was not for gold, but for keys. Zavadsky, who trusted no one, used this hiding place to store the next, more complex clue, which only a person knowledgeable in geography and prospecting methods could understand.
Voron examined the safe.
A new third riddle was engraved on its lid. The bear's tear, folded 3 times, will point to the place where the sun sleeps. It was a cryptogram of coordinates.
The bear's tear was obviously the name of a local river or lake. Folded 3 times was a cipher based on a geographical calculation known only to Zavadsky. But the safe was locked, and the key to it, as Voron understood, was not here. The killer Alexei could not open the safe. He found it, realized that Zavadsky was continuing the game, and, leaving his tools behind, returned to eliminate his last competitor, Voron. He knew that Voron would inevitably come here.
Voron smelled kerosene again. He quickly scanned the walls and ceiling with his eyes. In the corner, under the ceiling, he noticed a fresh, sloppy disguise, a piece of old tarpaulin covering something.
Voron pulled a box toward him, stood on it, and tore off the tarpaulin. There was a stick of dynamite attached to a log, with a wire leading to a primitive but functional detonator, controlled by the same radio transmitter that lay on the floor. Alexei, a geologist who knew a thing or two about explosives, had booby-trapped the cache. He couldn't take the gold, but he could destroy the key and eliminate his competitor. The killer wasn't just trying to avoid punishment. He was trying to disrupt the search itself, so that no one but him could find the cache. Voron carefully pulled the wires out of the detonator. He knew that Alexei was somewhere nearby, waiting for the moment to press the button. The killer would not back down. He left a trace of his aggressive, impatient greed. Voron left the hut, leaving the safe and the diffused trap behind. He deliberately left visible traces that he had found the safe, but couldn't open it. He hoped that Alexei, seeing him leave, would rush to the hideout to retrieve the birch bark and the safe that Voron had left open. Raven knew the hunt wasn't over yet. He had thrown the killer off balance. Alexei was no longer just looking for gold. He was seeking revenge for his exposure and feared Raven. He would act ruthlessly and quickly. Raven had to return to the trading post to find the true key to the mystery where the crime began, one that neither Zavadsky nor the killer could see. He looked at the tracks he himself had left behind. Now he was alive, and he was ready for the next turn. He felt Alexei breathing down his neck, and that feeling was sharper than the cold Siberian air. Raven walked away, taking with him only a new code and knowledge of the murder weapon, the ability to handle explosives and traps. He walked to the place where the sun sleeps. Raven and Shadow were returning to the trading post, but their path was far from direct. He knew that Alexei, whose impatience and greed had already been exposed, would not give him time. The killer, having discovered the disabled trap and the mined but unexploded cache, must have realized that Raven knew. And now Alexei would become not a hunter, but a hunted beast, trying to cover his tracks and destroy the last witness. Ivan Andreevich returned to the hut, but not to go inside. He walked around it in a wide circle, studying Alexei's tracks. The geologist, convinced of his failure, moved quickly, his tracks deep and sloppy. He hurried back, probably to try to destroy the hatch leading to the underground chamber of the trading post, or to activate Plan B, if there was one. Voron approached the safe inside the hut again. He knew that Alexei had been unable to open it, but it was this very safe, which Voron had saved from the explosion, that was the key to the next mystery. A complex cryptogram was engraved on its lid. The bear's tear, folded 3 times, will point to the place where the sun sleeps. The safe did not contain gold, but a set of old-fashioned navigational instruments, an astrolabe, a sextant, a magnetic compass, and a small sheet of paper rolled into a tube. This was the third and most difficult clue, a set of coordinates encrypted as a combination of local river names and elevations that were not marked on official maps. Voron realized that Zavadsky was not playing for gold, but for time. He was deceiving the heirs, creating smokescreens to weed out those who were only looking for easy money. The first riddle was about local folklore and place names known to Peter. The second was about prospectors' hideouts, known to Alexei. The third was about complex taiga navigation, known only to Zavadsky. An illegal gold miner would never leave gold on the surface in an easily accessible place, Voron reasoned, shifting his gaze to the old astrolabe. All these places are intermediate posts, created to test greed and patience. He began deciphering it, using his knowledge of the toponymy of the Sion Nature Reserve, where he had worked for years. Bear's Tear was not a river, but a high mountain lake known for its shape and for feeding 3 streams that flowed into different valleys. Triply folded. Voron realized that Zavadsky had used an ancient, almost forgotten method of triple navigation, where each geographical point was superimposed on 2 others, forming a triangular cipher. The devices in the safe were cipher tools. Zavadsky demanded that his heirs not simply find the coordinates, but calculate them using ancient, semi-mystical taiga names. It was the old millionaire's last, philosophical mockery of the modern world. Voron superimposed the names of rivers, passes, and heights on the map that Zavadsky had left in his office. He used a sextant and an astrolabe to add these points into a single meaningful triangle. The point of convergence of this triangle gave the exact location. An abandoned old tunnel on the slope of a mountain, which in local myths was called where the sun sleeps. The place where the sun hides behind the horizon. The tunnel was not far from the trading post, only 5 kilometers away, but it was perfectly hidden. The secret room was nearby, but Zavadsky made them take a round trip into the wilderness to test their humanity. He knew that gold changes people and decided to give it not to the most greedy, but to the most patient or the most intelligent. Ivan Andreevich quickly gathered his instruments. He had the final point, and he knew that Alexei, upon his return, would also try to figure it out. Alexei was a geologist. He might have known about the tunnel, but he couldn't have known about the code. His knowledge was professional, but not intimate, like Zavadsky's. Voron realized that Zavadsky's deception was ingenious. He had created the illusion of easy prey in order to weed out those who were willing to kill for it. He had tested the heirs for greed, and one of them, Alexei, had failed the test, paying for it with Peter's blood. Returning to the trading post, Voron again smelled kerosene and felt tension. Alexei was already there. Voron did not enter the main hall, where the killer was waiting for him. Or rather, lying in wait. He walked around the trading post and headed for the barn, where he found a hatch. This hatch was closed but not locked. Alexei must have returned to make sure the underground passage was secure. The Raven didn't know what awaited him down in the tunnel. He knew that the secret room was most likely Zavadsky's true, hidden legacy, his greatest achievement, or his darkest deed. But he also knew that Alexei wouldn't be able to resist. The killer, confident that the Raven had figured out the location, would be waiting for him there in the darkness to deliver the final blow. The Raven called to the shadow. "Stand guard," he whispered, nodding toward the hatch. The shadow lay down, blending into the shadows of the wall, her amber eyes remaining alert. The Raven lifted the hatch. A chill, dampness, and the smell of iron wafted out. The smell of an abandoned tunnel. He descended into the darkness, carrying with him only the cryptogram of coordinates and a philosophical understanding of this game. It was the last and most dangerous stage. He was going to the place where the sun sleeps, to find gold, but above all, to find the killer who had disrupted the natural order of things and now had to answer according to the laws of the taiga, which knew no mercy. Raven knew that a reckoning awaited him, and it would not be a simple arrest. It would be a restoration of order. Leaving the hatch in the barn closed but not locked, Raven deliberately created a vacuum of anticipation. He knew that Alexei, whose impatience had already cost Peter his life, would not be able to sit idly by. The killer had to decide. Either eliminate Voron before he entered the tunnel, or be the first to slip into the underground passage. Ivan Andreevich returned to the main hall of the trading post, where nervous excitement reigned. Georgie tried to calm Marina, who was either crying or demanding to leave immediately. Lydia sat like a stone statue, watching everything with cold detachment. Alexei, standing by the window, pretended not to notice Voron. "I know the place," Voron announced, his words sounding like thunder in the silence of the hall. "The secret room is in a tunnel, which can be accessed from under the shed. I'm going there. But first, gentlemen, you must understand that Zavadsky's game is not over." He placed a small, rusty key to a safe on the table next to the birch bark, which he had discreetly removed from the device in the hiding place. All eyes, filled with wild, undisguised greed, turned to the key. I deciphered the third riddle, and it led me to the final point. It led me here, to the trading post. As an illegal immigrant, Zavadsky couldn't leave the gold on the surface. All his riddles are a path to redemption. But one of you decided that this path was too long and punished the one who walked faster than everyone else. Voron slowly turned his gaze to Alexei. Alexei turned away toward the window. "Your accusations are baseless, Raven. You're just trying to raise your price so you can be the first to get your hands on the gold." His voice sounded threateningly confident. Raven did not argue. He knew that words were powerless when a predator's instinct came into play. He had to provoke Alexei. "I'm going to the tunnel," Raven repeated, picking up his backpack. "And I know the killer will follow me." He left the trading post, deliberately leaving open the birch bark, with the last, incorrectly deciphered riddle he had left on the table. He wanted Alexei to believe that Voron was still looking for a surface hideout and didn't know about the underground passage. Voron had not gone 100 meters from the trading post when the hunt began. He heard quiet, quick footsteps behind him. "Alexei." The killer could not wait. Voron turned sharply toward the stream flowing past the trading post, pretending to be heading for the mountain passes. By the stream, where the ground was damp and clayey, Raven suddenly smelled something burning. Ignat Savadsky kept an old boat here. Raven approached the boat. The gas tank had been opened, and gasoline was leaking out, mixing with the water. It was sabotage, intended to prevent Raven from quickly retreating or transporting any gold he might have found. But the sabotage was clumsily done. Whoever did it did not take into account that there was too little gasoline left in the tank to cause a major fire. The killer's impatience and unprofessionalism gave him away again. Voron bent down to examine the scene of the sabotage. On the clayey bank, next to the gasoline stains, he found what he was looking for: a handprint. Not the entire palm, but the tips of the fingers, which left a deep, distinctive mark on the wet clay. It was not an ordinary print. "A handprint," muttered Raven. "Too strong, too confident." There, under the bush, he found a roughly tied knot made of thick rope, which had obviously been used to tear off the gas tank cap. The knot was wrong. Not a hunting knot, not a tourist knot. It was a mountain knot, a professional knot, used by geologists or rock climbers. A knot that had been tied in a hurry, but its specificity was obvious. Voron connected the facts. Geologist, knowledge of explosives, mountain knot. Everything pointed to Alexei. The killer was a man who knew the methods of the taiga, but did not respect them. He used them as an urban tool, and therefore constantly made mistakes. At that moment, Raven heard quick footsteps behind him. Alexei, confident that Raven was still examining the boat, decided to attack. He jumped out from behind the trees with a heavy, rusty crowbar in his hands. There was no fear or reason in his eyes, only feverish greed and murderous determination. "You ruined everything, Raven," Alexei growled. "You're meddling where you shouldn't. This is mine. I knew Ignat. I helped him. And I will find that gold." It was a confession that burst from the depths of his obsession. He didn't wait. He lunged forward. Voron, without flinching, jumped aside. The crowbar sank into the clayey ground with a dull thud. The shadow, which had been sitting quietly at its master's feet, growled and lunged at Alexei. The geologist, not expecting the dog to attack, was distracted for a moment. Voron took advantage of that split second. He didn't fight back. He acted like a survival instructor, quickly, precisely, neutralizing the threat. He punched Alexei in the solar plexus, causing him to double over in pain and drop the crowbar. "I'm going to the tunnel, Alexei. If you want the gold, you'll follow me. But now my rules apply," Raven said hoarsely. He knew he wouldn't be able to hold him for long. Greed is too strong a motivation. Voron quickly tied Alexei with an old hunting cord, using a reliable, unbreakable knot that even a geologist couldn't untie. He left him there, on the bank of the stream, under the watchful eye of Shadow, who lay down nearby, resting her head on her paws. but her eyes never left the prisoner. "You will stay here until I return," said Raven. "If you take a step, you will learn what the law of the tiger is." He knew that Shadow would not fail him. He headed for the trading post to get a lantern and his old compass. He had to descend into the darkness, into an abandoned tunnel that local myths called Where the Sun Sleeps. He was going there not just as a detective. He was going as an enforcer who had to end Zavadsky's game and restore the balance that had been disrupted by greed. He knew that Alexei, even tied up, would still try to escape. But now, it would be a chase in which the beast had already been caught, and all that remained was to wait for him to return to his lair. He opened the hatch in the shed. The cold, damp air of the tunnel hit him in the face. Ahead lay the secret room. And behind it, the truth that Zavadsky had hidden all his life. The Raven, as still as stone, began his descent, plunging into absolute, oppressive darkness. Leaving Alexei tied up under the watchful eye of the Shadow, Ivan Andreevich returned to Zavadsky's office. He knew that greed was a disease and that it was impossible to cure, but it could be neutralized. Zavadsky's riddle was the final diagnosis of this disease. The key to the secret room was in Voron's head, but he needed material proof for himself. Confirmation of the inverted taiga meaning of the coordinates. On the wall hung Zavadsky's handwritten map, where mythical names replaced real ones. Shaman's Cry, Bear's Tear, Wild Boar Ridge. The third riddle, the Bear's Tear folded 3 times, will point to the place where the sun sleeps. Was not just a cipher, but the mysticism of the mountains. The Raven knew that Bear's Tear was a glacial lake located in a deep crevice where mountain ranges converged on 3 sides. Folded 3 times was a reference to the 3 streams flowing from it, each of which Zavadsky, as an expert on illegal trails, used as a geodetic line. As a former inspector, Voron knew this area like the back of his hand. He didn't need an astrolabe, but he understood that Zavadsky had left it behind to weed out those who think rationally from those who feel the taiga. The real key was in the names. He compared Bear's Tear with the sketch of the tunnel he found in Zavadsky's box. Where the sun sleeps, in the language of the local peoples, this meant the western, hidden slope, where the sun's rays never penetrated. Zavadsky, an illegal gold miner, used myths to hide the truth from the authorities and from overly greedy heirs. The final point was not on the surface, but under the trading post. When building his fortress, Zavadsky did not just reinforce the walls. He dug deep into the ground, laying a secret passage to an abandoned old tunnel that led to the real gold vein or hiding place. It was a brilliant solution. The most valuable things are hidden where people look for the most obvious. Voron understood the key to the killer. Alexei was a geologist. He was the only one of the HEIRS who had professional knowledge of the tunnels and ore workings that might be in the area. He could quickly calculate the tunnel as the final destination using his skills, but he could not know the inverted mystical meaning of the taiga names that Zavadsky used for the cipher. The killer possessed the specific knowledge to circumvent Zavadsky's logic, but lacked the patience of the taiga. He knew that the tunnel was the target, but did not know that Zavadsky had turned it into a trap. He waited until Voron himself, after a long journey, named the final destination so that he could then eliminate him. The knot on the stream. the explosives in the cache. These were all clumsy, aggressive attempts by a man who was used to controlling matter, but was powerless against Voron's character and knowledge. Voron took a flashlight out of his backpack and, ignoring the remaining heirs in the hall, Marina, who now stared in horror at the closed hatch, and Georgie, who was whispering something about the police, headed for the barn. He knew that Alexei would not be able to remain tied up for long. The geologist was strong and desperate. Descending into the cold and dampness of the underground, Voron turned on the flashlight. The beam of light revealed a roughly hewn tunnel leading down from the trading post. The walls were reinforced with old, darkened logs. It smelled of damp earth, metal, and decay. This was Zavadsky's world, a world built on paranoia and gold. "The mine and the shadow," Raven muttered, his breath hanging in the air. He walked slowly, straining all his senses. He knew the killer was waiting. The killer would use the darkness and his knowledge of the underground passages. He walked about 50 meters. The tunnel led him into an old, spacious tunnel, which, judging by all appearances, had been abandoned back in Soviet times. It was cold and quiet here. Too quiet. Voron noticed new tracks on the clay floor of the tunnel. The prints of expensive, professional boots. Alexei. He had managed to free himself, gotten ahead of Voron, and gone down to destroy the evidence, or, finally, take the treasure. Voron felt tension in the air, a presence. He saw that the tunnel had been prepared. Several supports had been knocked out or blown up, and the walls were covered with fresh cracks. The killer's trap. Alexei planned to collapse the tunnel to bury Raven along with the secret room. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to cover up his crime. The Raven stopped at the turn. He knew that a direct attack was what the killer was expecting. He had to use his opponent's character against him. Alexei's greed was his weakness. The Raven raised his lantern. He noticed the light, a thin yellow strip shining through a crack in the wall. At the end of the tunnel, behind the collapse, was the secret room. Zavadsky's secret. At that moment, there was a sharp metallic click. Alexei. He was here. He had activated the last trap. Raven took a step back, pressing himself against the wall. He knew what was about to happen. He waited. He was ready. The reckoning was beginning. And only calmness could save him from panic and the killer's greed. He was Raven, and he had come to restore order to the taiga. The underground passage leading from the trading post's barn was a cold, smelly artery, where time had stopped. Raven moved forward slowly, his lantern picking out the damp, darkened logs that Zavadsky had once used to reinforce the tunnel. The shadow he left at the hatch was his last line of defense and first warning.
Raven knew that if Alexei had managed to untie the knot, he had already come down here, possessed by a thirst for gold and the certainty that he was now one step ahead.
The shaft to which the tunnel led turned out to be vast, with a high vaulted ceiling, which in some places was reinforced with wooden supports, and in others simply propped up stones, ready to collapse. It smelled of stale metal and deadly silence. Voron turned off his flashlight, allowing his eyes to adjust to the darkness, and moved forward, relying only on sound and sensation. He could hear small drops falling from the ceiling, and this sound, steady and monotonous, was the perfect cover for his quiet footsteps. Raven knew that Alexei, as a geologist, would use collapses and floods. These were his professional traps.
Sure enough, he quickly discovered that several key supports had been loosened or removed. The killer had prepared the tunnel for a collapse aimed at eliminating Raven. It was a last-ditch attempt to destroy all competitors and cover up his crime.
Voron bypassed the dangerous areas, moving along the very edge of the tunnel. He found a thin wire running along the wall, the last cord that could activate the collapse or detonator. It was a trap designed to cause panic. Alexei must have been waiting for him, so that the moment Raven was at the epicenter, he could pull it. He moved on, his heartbeat steady, like that of a predator. At the end of the tunnel, behind a pile of fallen rocks which, judging by the fresh chips, had collapsed recently, a thin beam of light was visible. The secret room. Raven rounded the rubble, and there, behind the wall, was a cave, a natural grotto, enlarged and reinforced by hand. It was the true secret room of Ignat Zavadsky. But there was no gold there. Instead of ingots and bags of ore, Voron saw a small, neatly arranged hiding place. The walls of the cave were not littered with nuggets, but with unique, ancient artifacts of the peoples of Siberia. Stone idols, painted tways, carved bone decorations. In the center stood a simple wooden chest, and above it hung an old leather bag. The Raven approached the chest. It was empty, but at the bottom lay a thick, yellowed notebook, the personal diary of Ignat Zavadsky. This was Zavadsky's secret. An eccentric millionaire who had made his fortune from illegal mining, he had devoted the last years of his life to collecting and preserving what he had once despised: the heritage of the land, its history. In the diary, written in uneven handwriting, Voron read a confession. I searched for gold all my life, like a man possessed. I found it, and I realized that it was worthless. The true treasure is the earth and its memory. I left these riddles to test them. Anyone looking for a quick buck would fail at the first step. Anyone who finds this room must understand that gold is not everything. The Raven understood. Zavadsky had defeated greed even after death. He had deceived everyone who came for his money. He left a philosophical legacy that could only be appreciated with the heart, not with a bank account. At that moment, the silence in the tunnel was shattered. There was a sound from behind that could not be mistaken for anything else: the sharp scraping of metal on stone. I knew you were here, Raven. I knew you were too stubborn. Alexei stood in the passageway, his face contorted with wild, insane rage. In his hands was a heavy, short crowbar, which he must have found in the tunnel. He looked frantic. His eyes darted feverishly from Raven to the chest. Greed had finally torn off his mask. "Where's the gold?" Alexei croaked, his voice trembling. "You found it. I don't believe your nonsense about inheritance. Zavadsky couldn't have left us nothing but old junk." Voron calmly picked up the diary. "This is the gold, Alexei. The thing you killed Peter for and tried to kill me for. You disrupted the natural order of things for the sake of an empty illusion." The killer's trap had worked. Alexei was sure that Raven would find the gold and hide it. He couldn't believe that the real treasure was truth and memory. His mind, poisoned by greed, couldn't accept the philosophical conclusion. "You're lying!" Alexei shouted.
He took a step forward, the crowbar raised. "I'll get what I deserve."
You'll die here, and everyone will think it was a collapse. The raven calmly stepped back, his gaze heavy as a raven's, never leaving the killer. He knew that now would be the final battle, a battle not for life, but for order. He had to remove the diseased individual, to restore the balance in the taiga, disrupted by the gold rush. He was ready to meet death, but he would not allow greed to win. He stood face to face with absolute evil, born of greed. Alexei's voice, piercing and frantic, echoed off the damp walls of the tunnel. Face to face. It was inevitable. The final reckoning, where not only the fate of the inheritance would be decided, but also the restoration of order. The raven stood at the entrance to the secret room, holding Zavadsky's old diary in his hands, while Alexei stood 10 paces away, his body shaking with greed, which had transformed him into a cornered predator. He clutched the crowbar, his eyes burning in the darkness, reflecting the light of the lantern. "You're lying. I know you're lying," Alexei shouted, taking a nervous, sharp step forward. "Gold can't just be old junk." Zavadsky was a millionaire. He couldn't have left behind mementos. You found it and want to take it for yourself. Voron spoke quietly, in a low, hoarse voice that seemed to be part of the silence of the tunnel itself. He was not defending himself. He was exposing. "I'm not looking for gold, Alexei. I'm looking for the truth that you tried to bury. Your greed made you impatient, and that gave you away. I read you like an open book of the taiga." The raven raised his hand, pointing to the tunnel. "Your city skills are your telltale sign. You're a geologist. You know how to tie professional knots for mountaineering equipment. But when you killed Peter, you tied his boat with a clumsy, hasty mountaineering knot because you were blinded by greed. The knot you tried to use to secure the boat is a knot you know. But you mixed it up in your panic, and your boot, with its expensive, aggressive tread, left a clean footprint by the cedar tree when you dumped Peter's body, simulating a fall. You were too confident to hide the main thing, the absence of fear where there should have been alarm. Your knowledge of explosives, continued Voron, not allowing Alexei to interject. That's geological exploration knowledge. You mined the hideout on the farm, trying to destroy the key when you couldn't open the safe. But you don't respect the forest. You are not a taiga dweller. You tried to imitate the laws of the taiga, to set traps, but you did it clumsily, like a man who fears not the consequences, but the loss of control over the situation. Alexei flinched, his face contorted in a grimace of helplessness and rage. He realized that Voron had seen not just traces, but his psychological portrait. "I didn't kill him," he shouted, but his voice broke into a shriek. "It's his own fault. He was the first. He would have taken everything." "And I deserved it more than he did. I studied this land. I know where the veins lie. Gold is the order I had to establish." Raven shook his head. "Gold is a lie, Alexei. And order in the taiga is established not by man, but by the natural course of things. You killed a man for a piece of metal that, as you can see, isn't here. You broke the most important law. Don't kill for profit. It's a crime that wasn't worth Peter's life or your soul." "You're talking nonsense. The laws of nature," Alexei roared. He raised the crowbar and lunged forward. His eyes reflected only his obsession with gold, even when he was faced with the truth. It was the beast's final throw. Voron did not dodge the blow. He used his knowledge of the space. The moment Alexei swung, Voron stepped sharply to the side, moving close to the wall. The crowbar struck the mine support directly behind him with a terrifying screech. The force of the blow was tremendous, and at that moment, Raven, using Alexei's momentum, pushed him under his arm. Alexei lost his balance and tripped over a rock that Voron, as an experienced taiga dweller, had noticed in advance. He flew forward, hitting the wall of the tunnel. The crowbar flew to the side and fell into the water with a dull thud. Voron did not give him time to recover. He did not retaliate. He simply pinned Alexei against the wall, holding him while he struggled with panic and rage. "Accept it, Alexei. You lost. Not to me, but to yourself." The struggle was short and intense. Raven, wiry and strong, remained calm and in control. Alexei, overcome by panic and thirst, quickly ran out of steam. His greed had made him weak. When Alexei went limp, Raven let him go, and he slumped to the wet floor. Raven took out a cord and quickly and professionally tied him up. Justice had been served. Ivan Andreevich left the secret room, taking Zavadsky's diary with him. The secret had been revealed. He left Alexei waiting in the tunnel where he had tried to bury the truth. He climbed up the tunnel. At the hatch, Shadow, his faithful guard, greeted him with a calm whimper. Raven opened the hatch and climbed up into the twilight. Order had been restored. All that remained was to present Zavadsky's true inheritance to his relatives and bring the murderer to justice. He looked at the trading post, which now seemed less like a fortress and more like a prison, built on human greed. He knew that the ending to this story would be unexpected, but fair. He had to show them that gold wasn't everything. The damp silence of the tunnel, broken only by Alexei's desperate breathing, was replaced by Voron's low, hoarse voice. The fight was short but fierce. Voron was not seeking revenge, he was seeking neutralization. He used not force, but knowledge of the space, and a calmness that was completely absent in his opponent. Alexei, possessed by greed, was unstable. His movements were imprecise, and his eyes darted around in search of what he never found. Gold. The raven tied the geologist with a strong, unbreakable knot that would only tighten the harder Alexei tried to break free. The killer, now lying on the damp floor, was breathing heavily, his face ashen with helplessness and the realization of failure. He had lost, not physically, but philosophically. Ivan Andreevich quickly inspected the tunnel. He made sure that the collapse trap had been neutralized and that there were no other signs that Alexei had managed to set additional traps. Then he headed for the secret room, carrying the exhausted geologist on his shoulder. "Look, Alexei," Voron said quietly, leading the killer to the chest and artifacts. "This is what you killed Peter for. The heritage of the earth, not metal." Alexei, seeing the collection of ancient artifacts and diaries, exploded. "This is a lie. Ignat Petrovich couldn't have been such an old fool. He made millions. This is a deception. You hid everything. Where is the gold?" Zavadsky, as he himself writes in his diary, returned the gold to the land, or sold it, and directed the money to the preservation of the heritage of the Siberian peoples.
He left you a temptation, Alexei.
He left you a path you could have taken, but you chose greed and violence. Voron turned to the page of the diary where it was written, "Those who come here must understand. The most important treasure is peace, not gold. Those who seek only metal will find nothing but emptiness."
The Raven did not wait for his reaction. He took out his satellite phone, and leaving Alexei under the supervision of the Shadow, who had already come running at his call, contacted Smirnov.
"Precinct officer, come here. I have the killer and the secret room. The killer is Alexei. Don't take the boat. Walk. He's set traps." A few hours later, as the sun was setting, Smirnov and 2 operatives arrived at the factory.
Voron met them at the hatch and pointed down. "The killer is there, tied up, waiting." Smirnov, seeing the exhausted but calm Voron and his faithful dog, just shook his head.
He had long understood that Ivan Andreevich worked by his own rules, but his justice was always absolute. The operatives descended into the tunnel and brought Alexei out. The geologist was broken.
He did not try to resist. His greed and confidence had evaporated, leaving only emptiness behind. Voron gathered the remaining relatives, Georgie, Marina, and Lydia, in the trading post hall. Tired and frightened, they waited for the outcome.
"The secret room has been found," Voron announced. He placed Zavadsky's diary and several artifacts on the table, a carved bone idol and an old, worn-out box. "An inheritance is not millions. It is the memory and legacy of the land. Ignat Petrovich did not leave you wealth, but a test of humanity, which you failed. Your relative, Alexei, killed Peter because you could not accept that gold is not everything." The reaction was shocking and ambiguous. Georgie, a financier, first examined the artifacts suspiciously, then burst into tears. These were not tears of grief, but of shattered hopes. He realized that the goal for which he had come was an empty illusion. Marina, an actress, approached the artifacts and picked up a carved idol. Something more than greed flashed in her eyes, an awareness of beauty and depth. For the first time, it seemed, she saw not money, but a true treasure. Lydia, the eldest, nodded silently. Ignat was always a philosopher. He knew what awaited us. He wanted us to understand. But greed, it always wins. There was quiet sadness and acceptance of fate in her words. Zavadsky defeated greed even after death. He left no inheritance that would corrupt or kill. He left the truth, which only a person purified of greed could appreciate. The Raven handed the diary to Smirnov for inventory. "This is Zavadsky's last message. He wanted people to know that the true price of life is not in gold, but in order and memory." Voron, satisfied with the restoration of order, stepped aside. His work was done. The sick individual had been removed from the ecosystem. Now the law would take its course. But Voron knew that the law of the taiga had already passed its sentence. Alexei, obsessed with gold, found only emptiness and prison. He left the trading post. The shadow followed him. The trading post, illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun, no longer seemed like a fortress, but a monument to human stupidity. The Raven felt the deep moral meaning of his work. He was the defender of balance, and he knew that his journey was not yet over. The morning after the climax brought a thick, heavy calm to the trading post. The police officers who had arrived from the mainland worked methodically and, as usual, clumsily for this place. They examined the tunnel, sealed the artifacts, and recorded the arrest of Alexei, who now sat in the corner of the hall, covered with a blanket, completely empty and defeated. His mad obsession with gold had been replaced by a cold, silent horror at the truth that had been revealed. Ivan Andreevich stood aside, watching the commotion. His task was complete. The killer had been found. Order restored. But now began the stage he despised. Bureaucracy. He had to write a report for the authorities, where his unique methods had to be reduced to logic and testimony. He couldn't write, "I read the lie in the suspect's gait," or "I smelled greed and kerosene." He sat down at Zavadsky's desk, took out his old notebook, and wrote a brief, cynical report. It boiled down to the following. His nephew Peter, having discovered the key to the tunnel, was killed by Alexei, who, using his geological knowledge, quickly calculated the locations, but in the end was unable to cope with the trap he himself had set and was detained by the consultant. No traces of fear. No overturned tiger meanings. Just dry facts for the prosecutor. While he was writing, Shadow, his faithful guardian, lay at his feet. Smirnov approached him. "You're always right, Raven. Always. And that's scary. Tell me, what did he say to you down there? About the gold? Not for the record, just for me." Raven looked up, his gaze heavy as mountain lead. He said that gold was the order he had to establish. He couldn't understand that Zavadsky, that old wolf, had changed. He had overcome his greed. He left behind not treasure, but temptation. Ivan Andreevich picked up Zavadsky's diary and the carved bone idol, the main exhibit in the secret room. Zavadsky's secret was before him. The personal diaries confirmed his guess. The search was the final test. Repenting of his illegal past, Zavadsky had devoted his last years to preserving the cultural heritage of Siberia, using his wealth to buy up artifacts and memories of the land. In one of his last entries, dated just a week before his death, Zavadsky wrote, "I knew they would come. Greed has no expiration date. I wanted them to stop, to see that I had found the true treasure, not in stone, but in the soul of the earth. But who among them is capable of understanding this?" Voron felt a deep, quiet respect for the old millionaire. Zavadsky had made amends and, even after death, had brought justice. He had set up a game that revealed the most sick individual in the pack. And the punishment for this murder was absolute. He went out into the hall, where Georgie and Marina sat devastated next to Lydia. Georgie, a financier, looked broken. "So, nothing? No millions? We've come all this way. We lost Peter. For some old bones and a diary?" His voice was not so much angry as bitterly incredulous. Marina, an actress, looked at the carved idol that Voron had placed on the table with different eyes. He was a poet? He wanted us to see beauty? We didn't even bother to read him to the end. Her words betrayed the first glimmer of guilt, born not of fear, but of a lost opportunity. Lydia, an elderly woman, nodded silently to Voron. She understood the philosophical conclusion. Ignat was always against the corrupting power of gold. He knew what it had done to him, and he wanted his last money to serve the truth, not greed. Voron knew that his mission of purification was complete. He had removed the diseased individual from the ecosystem, Alexei. He had restored balance, showing that gold was nothing compared to human life,
and the memory of the earth.
He handed over the artifacts and diary to Smirnov, who promised to keep them safe until they could be transferred to a museum or foundation that Zavadsky had apparently created to preserve the collection. "I'm leaving, Smirnov. The documents will be finished in 2 days. I'll be by the river," said Voron. He did not say goodbye to his heirs. His moral sense did not require words. He simply turned and left. George, Marina, and Lydia remained in the hall, alone with their emptiness and unexpected truth. They had come for gold, but found death, crime, and philosophical reproach from a dead relative. Voron felt a quiet sadness. Zavadsky had won his last game, but the price was murder. He knew that greed was a virus that could return, but for now, order had been restored. He walked toward the river to leave the trading post, this fortress of greed behind him forever. It was time to say goodbye. Zavadsky's trading post, this fortress built on gold and paranoia, was now just a crime scene and a museum of dashed hopes. Ivan Andreevich and the Shadow moved toward the river, leaving behind Smirnov and the operatives, who were busy with the tedious task of recording and collecting material evidence. The Raven carried with him only the truth, which neither the investigators nor the heirs could understand. He did not look back. He did not care how Georgie, Marina, and Lydia would divide Zavadsky's artifacts and philosophical legacy among themselves. He knew that greed would quickly find a new object, but order had been restored. The sick individual in the form of Alexei had been removed from the ecosystem, and now the forest could breathe again at its own natural rhythm. The Raven walked lightly, as if he had shed a heavy burden of responsibility. His moral code had been upheld. He did not seek revenge. He sought to restore balance. Zavadsky, the illegal prospector, had achieved redemption with his life, turning his wealth into memory and warning. And Raven, his unwitting executor, had completed this philosophical act. The shadow walking beside him seemed particularly calm. The dog, like its owner, felt that the tension had gone. She trusted Voron's instincts, his quiet but absolute justice. For the two of them, the tiger was not just a home, but a witness and a judge. Ivan Andreevich walked to the riverbank, from where he had arrived at the trading post 2 days earlier. Here, where the water washed away all traces, he stopped. He took out his old binoculars and, without raising them to his eyes, simply held them in his hand. He looked at the endless expanses of the taiga, the mountain passes, and the dense, impenetrable forests. His world was there, a world where the honest laws of nature clashed with the vicious laws of man. He knew that greed was the eternal engine of crime. People would continue to search for gold, cheat, and kill for illusory wealth. His work would never end. But he also knew that every violation of order left a trace that he could always read. For Raven, justice was not found in the paragraphs of the criminal code, but in restoring harmony. He could show leniency to a hunter who killed an animal to feed his family, but he was absolutely ruthless to Alexei, who killed for a piece of metal. It was a disease that had to be removed from the system. He looked at his hands, veiny, strong, covered with wrinkles. These hands carried the heavy burden of experience and understanding of human weakness. He had long been disillusioned with city laws, which often protected the greedy and influential. His only support remained his internal code of honor, forged in the wilderness, where survival and truth were synonymous. His philosophy of life was simple and harsh, balance above all else. Killing Peter for gold was a violation of that balance, and Raven, as the guardian of that order, had to put everything back in its place. He felt neither pride nor triumph, only a quiet sadness that human nature so easily succumbs to greed. He put on his backpack. His path lay back into the depths of the taiga, where he felt at home. He sought neither glory nor rewards. He sought the next trace that greed would leave on the body of the forest. Ivan Andreevich Belov, the Raven, adjusted his old hunting knife. He nodded to Tenny, and together they stepped from the shore into the thicket, their figures quickly dissolving into the dense, indifferent greenery. They became shadows of the taiga, its unspoken law. Their tracks quickly disappeared on the damp moss, becoming part of the endless and indifferent book of the taiga, which only Raven could read.